Hello everyone, Ryan Hassan here. Welcome to the Facebook Live. We're talking about adding a trauma-informed lens to your current practice. I'm joined pretty much as always by Matt Nettleton. Matt, how are you, mate?
I'm good.
So today we wanted to jump on and have a bit of a chat about, what is it to be trauma informed? Why is it beneficial no matter what the work we do or in life in general? Because Matt and I are releasing a course this week, which is a trauma informed certificate for coaches. And so we thought we'd jump on and maybe talk about, that a little bit and that kind of thing. We'll explain why we created the course in a minute, and then we'll go through some different aspects of being trauma informed. Before we do that, I encourage you, if you're jumping on live, to leave any comments or questions that you have based on what we've said. And if you're watching the replay, just put hashtag replay, and any questions that you have, pop them in the comments, and myself or Matt will get back to you with that. So the reason why we created the Trauma-Informed Certificate for Coaches was that in our main training, Embodied Processing, where we teach a method to safely work with trauma, we're getting a lot of students who were coaches already. So they've done, different coaching certifications through varying bodies and that kind of thing. And one of the things that they were told, we're hearing time and time again, is that, when it comes to trauma, don't work with it. Okay, so kind of keep your hands off. And we've heard this before, not just in coaching circles, but a lot of different, modalities and that kind of thing. And, Matt and I find that quite interesting, because if you've heard us before talk about trauma, the way we define trauma is very broad. It's pretty much every human being is walking around on a spectrum somewhere of trauma. So when we're told, don't see clients with trauma, we're ruling out nearly 100% of the population in our estimation. So we want to really create this training to be able to give coaches or anyone else working in mental health or even healthcare in general this lens to understand what trauma is. Because it's our strong opinion that if you aren't seeing something through a trauma-informed lens, you're missing such a giant piece of the puzzle of understanding why someone is presenting with a certain symptom or a certain issue. Even just in life, if you're not properly trauma-informed, you're going to get very, very frustrated and not understand why people act the way they do. When you start to understand things through a trauma-informed lens, you mightn't agree with certain behaviours, but you can at least understand the underlying roots and where it's coming from. Would you agree, Matt?
Yeah, and like that is the case where a lot of bodies are saying, the governing bodies are saying, like don't work with trauma. But then there's other sort of modalities that are just way undereducated that are saying work with trauma, like you do a weekend breathwork course and it's like you're qualified to work with, some higher
deep-seated trauma.
So we see these sort of extreme opposing opposites that sort of can play out in different areas. But, like to really understand trauma is to understand our development. It's to understand how our nervous system adapts to life, to being on the planet. And when we say, everyone has trauma, it's not like everyone has been abused or had an experience of being, sexually abused or had an experience of being bullied. It's not like that. Everyone has those abusive sort of situations, but most people do throughout their life have that sort of thing. But it's more like an understanding of how our survival physiology adapts, and especially through our development. It's like developmental trauma happens relationally or transpersonally, and everyone has that to a varying degree. We all have survival adaptations. We all have ways that we contort our authenticity. And we all have personality traits that aren't really ours, that are adaptations and ways that we've learned to survive our relationships and being on the planet. Coping strategies, survival coping strategies. Everyone has those to varying degrees. Some people, that's all their experience is. That was my experience. All my experience was an adaptation. I'd completely disconnected and shut down who I was because I had to do that as a child. And I think that's a lot of people's experiences. Other people's experiences, they may not have disconnected from their authentic self, but they might get into situations where they do disconnect and they start to live from an adaptation. And so, seeing like humanity through a trauma-informed lens, changes our relationship to each other. We start to see the wound beneath the behavior. we start to see why people do what they do and what's driving it. And it's like a shake-up of reality. Lots of our beliefs don't survive. It's like they pass through the lens of being trauma-informed, and a lot of our beliefs and the way we saw the world just fizzle out as they pass through that lens, and we start to see the world like very, very differently. And what this means for like coaches or counselors or whoever is interested in learning about this stuff is, we relate to our clients in a very, very specific way through the lens of like cognitive, there's something wrong with them, then I need to fix them. I need to reframe their thinking, all of that sort of stuff. All the cognitive based approaches. And, that creates a certain relationship to our client. And usually, what I see with a lot of psychotherapists, counselors, coaches, and all that sort of stuff, we're trying to fix what's wrong with the person, and all that does is actually embed the belief in the person that there's something wrong with me, even though they may feel better afterwards. As soon as they feel like shit again, that belief, there's something wrong with me, see, I told you it only lasted this long. And then we get addicted to try and get back to those highs. But when we start to see it through a trauma-informed lens with body awareness, and we start to work with our own trauma and see ourselves through a trauma-informed lens. I'm not sure if my video's frozen. Has it? Yeah, I can't hear. Hold on.
I got you loud and clear.
Okay, yeah. Is my video frozen back?
Nah, all good.
Okay, cool. It's frozen on my end. So when a client, when a practitioner starts to see their client through a trauma-informed lens, they start to relate to them very differently. And what I've found is a space of presence and understanding and holding that understanding and relating to like the relational aspect. That's what heals trauma, because trauma happened in relationship. So it heals relationally. It doesn't heal by us trying to fix the person. It heals by holding a certain space. It's like, I use this metaphor a lot in our training, where it's like, you don't make the garden grow. You set the right environment and the garden grows itself. You don't get in there and make the corn grow or the broccoli grow or the spinach grow or the carrots grow. You don't do that. It does itself. It's guided by another intelligence, and that's the same as what heals trauma. We create the space, we create the environment relationally, and the nervous system starts to heal itself. It's like you cut your hand and the cut on your hand begins to heal. And so when we're seeing things through a different lens and have a different understanding and are relating to it differently, we're creating that conducive environment for healing to then naturally occur.
Yeah, I love that. And it comes from a place, like Matt said, we're going to talk about some of the basic points of what happens inside of a human during a traumatic imprint. But inherently there's that belief that there's something wrong with me. I'm defective in some way. So if we can start to shake that belief by changing our energy to a client, then we start to create that better environment for them to start to heal, for their nervous system to start to heal. And what we're talking about here is really working at the roots instead of up at the branches. And so where we find a lot of people can get into strife is that, if someone's a compulsive liar, and then they come in and work with someone, then all of a sudden we create strategies around, let's practice telling the truth. And that strategy might work for a short amount of time, but as soon as that person is presented with a stressful situation, they'll revert back to lying, because that was a coping strategy based on a survival mechanism. As Matt was talking about, this is the contortions that we make. So unless we find the underlying roots and the traumatic imprints that led to compulsive lying, it's very, very hard to consciously just change the behavior on the surface. And it can embed that feeling like, because then as soon as we have that stressful situation and we go back to that old, reptilian and limbic part of our brain and we start lying again, it embeds that belief that, I'm never going to get better. I'm more fucked up than anyone else. And then we keep going down that path of being disappointed in ourselves. And oftentimes a coach or a therapist can be disappointed in the client as well. And we're just embedding this idea that there's something inherently wrong with this human being and they need to be fixed in some way. So I'll just quickly bring up the diagram here around sort of some of the key points of what happens to an individual during a traumatic imprint. This can happen at any stage of life. If you've taken any courses or watched me and Matt before, you may have seen this before, but we'll quickly just go over it here before we move on and talk about some other concepts. So trauma is not the thing that happens. Okay, we think the thing that happened outside of us, whether it was physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, whatever it is, deep shame and embarrassment, it's whatever happened out here in the world is what the trauma is, but it's not. Trauma is very subjective, and it is what happens inside of a human being as a result of the stimulus that came in through the senses. Thus, trauma being subjective means that what is traumatic for one individual may or may not be traumatic for another individual. This is why one of the traps that we fall into is that we compare our trauma to other people. And we go, oh, well, they've been through it.
I'll just add, it's not only subjective, it's physical as well at the same time. So it's experienced subjectively and physically.
Yeah.
Not that I can actually find a border between those two.
But as a society, we like to separate them. So
yeah. My experience of my body is a subjective experience, But
Exactly.
like if you look at someone's brain who's been traumatized, severely traumatized, it's very, very different to someone else's.
Exactly. And so if we think about some of the key points here, our system in overwhelm. So basically our system goes into a threat or a survival response, where we can go into a fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response. You may have heard that. These are stress responses that the nervous system goes into. They're the way that we try and best handle a perceived threat. And I say perceived threat because, that can be an actual threat of someone trying to physically harm me, or it may be just, and more often than not, is a threat to our attachment. So a threat to Matt spoke about developmental trauma being relational. And we're talking about attachment here. When we're younger, our attachment to our caregivers literally means life or death to us, and we will do anything to maintain that attachment. Thus, the contortions come into place. We contort, our true natural expression to try and work out who do I have to be and how do I have to behave to maintain that attachment. And this is where we have these contortions that all of a sudden don't get addressed, and we grow up and become an adult. And although attachment to our caregiver isn't necessary because we're an independent human, we still kind of act like a child in many scenarios because those attachment issues are still very, very present. So
it's like when you really, really see that, it's like you see, wow, that's the cause of almost every single problem that someone comes to me with. It's all based on that adaptation, that contortion of the self and who I am in order to adapt and survive. But now I'm an adult, and it's playing out within my relationship, or it's playing out within the way I sabotage my job, or it's playing out with money, or it's playing out with every scenario. It's infinite, But we can, when you really sort of grok the trauma lens, you can start to see, oh wow, these are just patterns based on early childhood, or based on that event that happened to them.
So true. And so this process is really one of unwinding what has happened to us. Because a lot of the time when we think about life and we think about learning something new, say, we're adding a skill, it's like we're adding something to us. Like if I want to learn basketball and I've never done it before, it's like I have to learn how to dribble, how to pass, how to shoot. So I'm kind of adding things to me. This process of working with trauma is the opposite. It's one of actually letting the parts of us that aren't the real us start to fall away, so we can actually find out who that is. And that's a big thing for a lot of people. It's one of the scariest moments for a lot of people as these things start to fall away. And then we have to ask that question, well, if I'm not these patterns, these behaviors, I'm not what's happened to me, then who or what the hell am I? and that can be, really, really confronting for a lot of people.
It's and that's a good way to put it. Because we're trying to add or fix something that we believe is broken. So it's not an addition, it's a negation.
So
we're
true.
starting to negate and work through the layers of these contortions and adaptations until we're just us. It's like I don't need to be good enough or not good enough. I'm just myself.
Yeah. And that's so just let that land for anyone watching, because that's when you'll start to notice some contortions. When you think, I don't have to be enough or not enough, I don't have to be good or bad, I just have to be me. And then you'll notice a lot of people, we have this, I don't know if I can do that. And that's the contortion. That's the contortion going, no, you can't do that, because when you were doing that when you were younger was a threat to the attachment. So that contortion goes, no, maintain attachment. And this is why people say time heals all wounds. Bullshit. Time doesn't heal all wounds, because we can be 50 years old and our parents could be dead, yet we will still have these contortions in certain situations that are to maintain attachment to our caregivers all of these decades later. So that's why, time kind of doesn't exist in the subconscious anyway. So system in overwhelm, we're in a threat response. Then we have stored emotional energies. That's when we actually store emotional energy within our body, within our soma. Our emotions at their core are feedback. They're a feedback mechanism to let us deal with our current environment. We are meant to get that message or that feedback and let the emotion go. How are we all going with that? It's easier said than done, right? Our culture, we are not taught how to properly deal with emotions, how to process emotions, how to get the feedback and start to move on. Let's take guilt for an example. Like guilt's like that tap on the shoulder that goes, "Oi, Ryan, you've just done something outside of your personal standards." And then we're meant to let guilt go, and we learn it becomes wisdom. Yet do we let guilt go? My God, we hold on to that thing for weeks, months, and years. We can wake up in the middle of the night and think of something stupid that we said 5 years ago, and it'll start to play on our mind, okay? This is stored emotional energy. We'll know that we have stored emotional energy if we think back to a memory in our past, and as soon as we take ourselves back there and start to relive it, all of those emotions start to come to the surface. Could be guilt, shame, anger, fear, sadness, hurt. That means the emotion was stored at the time of the event, and we're still carrying it within our system however long later. Creation of deficiency stories. So this is another aspect of trauma. This is when we'll start to create beliefs about ourselves and the world that greatly limit our experience or expression of what it is to be a human being. Matt said the core one. If you think about these deficiency stories being branches of a tree, the trunk is there is something wrong with me. Now they can show up in different forms, like I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy of love, I don't trust men, I don't trust women, money is evil, I fear conflict, all of this stuff. But the core of them is there is something inherently wrong with me as a human being. And that's a real heavy one that, you know, most people on this path have to deal with at some point. Nervous system dysregulation. So when our nervous system goes into overwhelm, when we go into a fight, flight, or freeze or fawn response enough, our nervous system adapts. So, you know, a lot of people that we see today, you know, the terms of people pleaser. People pleasing is a fawn response. So if I was challenged a lot, my nervous system, was challenged when I was younger, and my natural response was to go into a fawn. So to kind of make sure everything's okay, I don't want dad or mum to get angry, you know, all that kind of thing. Our nervous system adapts, and then that shows up in our relationships, in our friendships at work, and everything as an adult. Because once again, our nervous system is very clever, and it was trying to work out, how do I have to be wired and how do I have to adapt to survive in my environment? So once again, a lot of this process is a adaptation of the nervous system to try and find some sense of safety. You find someone else if their response is a flight response, so whenever they perceive some sort of stress or threat in their environment, that voice in their head goes, "Get the fuck out of here. Get out of here, get out of here," and we want to run. That's a flight response. Someone else might have a fight response where they just want to immediately get into an argument or even a physical altercation, because that is their adaptation. So a lot of this work is being able to rewire that nervous system and to find a much more safe connection with that.
And I just want to point out as well, it's like conscious will doesn't work to try and resolve these. It's like to say to yourself, it's you know, everyone knows those behaviors. It's like, you know, say someone's a shopping addict, I'm going to go to the shops, but I'm not going to buy anything, and then they're, you know, packing their car with like 50 bags of things they've just bought, blown all their money that they said they wouldn't spend, or like,
Bunnings.
you know, an addict, you know, saying I'm going to go hang with my mates, but I'm not going to use, like I'm done using, and then, you know, like as soon as it's in front of them doing it. It's the same part of the brain that's running the show in those situations that's doing this. It's survival, and you know, like you can't overcome your survival instinct by force of will. It hijacks this part of the brain, hijacks the frontal cortex. So if we say, I'm not going to people please anymore, my next relationship, I'm not going to, you know, choose the same guy, but then we're back in that same pattern. Everyone knows this. It's looping patterns. That's what I call them. And, you know, like conscious decision actually is just like rippling the surface of a pool or a pond or an ocean. But the current underneath that's driving the whole ocean is these lower survival quadrants of the brain. So, you know, like just willpower and just a conscious decision doesn't work. We have to work with the actual body and rewire ourselves on a nervous system level.
So true. And because like in those moments when we're like, well, I'm never going to do that in relationship again, like we mean it because we're talking with this part of the brain. But then it's like it's a different human being that when we're presented with certain situations and certain triggers come up, like Matt said, different part of the brain. So it's like we're not dealing with a prefrontal cortex, Ryan. We're dealing with a limbic or a reptilian or a cerebellum right, which is a very different person. It's very old programming as opposed to conscious thought.
Like, I'm never going to yell at my kids again. The amount of clients I've seen that have, had rage at their kids and their family, and they're like, I'm not going to do it anymore. Next session, I've completely lost the plot of them again. It's like they get hijacked, by Dan.
And then they load all the guilt and shame on top of that, and dig in a deeper hole. Yeah.
And it's horrible. It's really, really painful, to be that powerless. It is. And this is where, when we start to see things through a trauma-informed lens, see ourselves through a trauma-informed lens and our clients through a trauma-informed lens, we start to relate to it differently, and we can have compassion rather than that self-critic, judgmental shaming, like I've done it again. We start to see, okay, it's not actually my fault. Yes. Not as a way to sort of bypass and make excuses, because we can still own it, but something that can sort of soften around that huge amount of shame that can come up.
Yeah, well, that's right. Yeah, it's like the guilt and shame, which normally we pile on top of ourselves, which reinforces the problem. We can start to soften that and have compassion. So then we can, like Matt said, not give ourselves a free pass, but we can learn from what happened, because we speak about the guilt and shame cycle a lot, but it's this natural human instinct that if I guilt and shame myself, I won't do that thing again. That doesn't work. That does not work. It has the opposite effect. So the last dot point is orphaned part. So based on what we've spoken about in those first 4 dot points, we create what's called an orphaned part, which is basically a split off part of the psyche, which then starts to look around every corner for something similar happening again. Okay, now we have, as human beings, all sorts of orphaned parts in different areas of our life, and they'll get stimulated by life circumstances. If I have an abandonment traumatic imprint, then all of a sudden, if I'm in a relationship and we have an argument, then all of a sudden that orphan part may become stimulated, and all of the emotions and everything that comes along with that, and the beliefs, the deficiency stories, they all get unpacked as well, and we start acting from a traumatic imprint. And that might act one of 2 ways. That can be like, well, I'm going to cling on to this person like grim death so they don't leave me, or I'll attack them and leave them first so they don't hurt me. Okay, both are acting from a traumatic imprint, both are an orphaned part. So that is what happens inside of a human being when it comes to trauma. It's very important to see that lens there. So what I'll do now, I might just have a look at the comments here before we move on. Domestic violence is a huge one when it comes to traumatic imprints, absolutely. Appreciate you both so much. I've just watched a few of your videos on YouTube and haven't met anyone with so much knowledge. Thank you so much. It's good for the ego, feels nice. Is it possible? Is it possible to do sessions with either of you? We're not seeing new clients at the minute, but we do have an incredible directory of practitioners at the Centre for Healing. I'll post that in the comments after we jump off. People that have gone through our courses. There's a heap of people in there that'll help work with your current situation. My problem is having orphan parts. I block a lot out. Yep, that's one part as well. But blocking out, so that's, we talk about the functions of the subconscious mind. It has many functions. One of them is to keep us safe. It will start to block out and repress certain things if the subconscious deems that it'll be too dangerous for them to come into conscious awareness. That's why a lot of, when we talk about repressed memories, they can start to present themselves after we do a bit of work on ourselves, because the subconscious might feel, hey, that they have a higher capacity to tolerate maybe this memory or this part of our life coming up, but the subconscious is blocking them out for a reason. So that's why one of the things Matt and I teach is really building our capacity. So building our sense of a resource, building our sense of safety and support. As soon as that happens, we can start to welcome in a lot of these traumatic imprints, because they're coming into more of a safe space, so to speak, which will help the subconscious feel more safe.
It starts to reorganize everything. When we've got orphan parts, we've just got unintegrated imprints, hanging around. And I use this metaphor a lot as well. I use all my metaphors a lot, but it's like Neo in the Matrix when he's fighting Agent Smith, and there's thousands of him. There's just Agent Smith just keep coming and coming and coming, and that's what our subconscious can be like, especially if we've had a distressing life. We just have imprint after imprint, but what starts to happen in the nervous system on a real physical level is everything gets disorganized. and that shows up as like chronic anxiety, depression, shutdown, disengagement, dissociation, all of those sort of things, bipolar, borderline, all these mental health issues, really disorganized nervous system. And as these imprints start to come home and feel safe to come home and integrate, come home is another word for integrate, our nervous system starts to reorganize, and it starts to come back to homeostasis.
I was thinking about Agent Smith, and that's all his orphaned parts. And he was like, in a therapy session, he's like, look at all my orphaned parts. A real visual representation.
It is a really good visual representation.
Another comment, especially men can't cry, remember, cultural shit. Yeah, let's talk about that. We're going to get to different types of trauma, and one of them is collective trauma. So let's bring that up now. We'll just bring up the different things that we cover in the new course. It'll just give us a bit of a framework to talk about things. So we talk about what is trauma, which is part of what we just touched on, which what happens inside of a human being. So then we have the different types of trauma, and it's really important that we do broaden our perspective on this, because the cultural narrative kind of around trauma has always been, well, it's just these catastrophic events like sexual abuse, a veteran being away at war and witnessing or doing horrible things. And it happens to it's a very small percentage of the population. And the truth is, those definitely are trauma, but trauma is also much broader. There are different categories, and that percentage of humans that have trauma, like we said, is massive. So acute trauma is the first one, and those are those big catastrophic events that we're talking about. A hugely fearful and threat-inducing event happens that is way too much for the system to handle and outside of our ability to cope. And so that is acute trauma. Then we talk about developmental trauma. So developmental trauma is something that Matt and I are very passionate about, because it is our strong belief that the way that our culture in the West has been taught to parent over the last 30 or 40 years has led to so much developmental trauma through our culture. So developmental trauma
is the Ferber method.
Ferbilizer or something. I can't remember the name.
Ferberizing your children. Yeah.
Ferberizing them. And so, developmental trauma is these ongoing situations where there might be these subtle forms of abuse, these subtle forms of neglect, leaving a baby to cry it out, all of these kind of things that can cause nervous system dysregulation. Now, what happens, the reason why these are all trauma is because they can all show up the same, so it's like acute trauma. So a veteran returning from war can come home and all of a sudden he can't turn his hypervigilance off. He's always looking around the corner, looking at the exits of whatever cafe he's in, can't sleep at night, all of that kind of thing, which are symptoms of PTSD. Then also we can have someone with developmental trauma who's maybe had a mother or father with deep depression who weren't able to actually be emotionally attuned to the child, and that went on for a period of years. And so that child never quite developed what we'd call a ventral vagal or safe connection. And then all of a sudden that child can grow up and have the exact same symptoms as the person with the PTSD from war. We can have someone who gets really harshly bullied from grade 2 to grade 6. And all of a sudden, the bullying stops, but all of a sudden that can manifest later in life as those same symptoms of PTSD. Right now, the medical model, they talk about CPTSD, which is complex PTSD, which is basically a PTSD they're like, we can't tell where it's come from, which means it'll be a developmental or a pre-conscious trauma kind of thing going on, because they can show up in the same way.
Or it can mean multiple. Ongoing and multiple. So it's so complex, so disorganized that you can't pinpoint.
Yeah.
Where it came from. It's like, for 15 years I experienced 5,000 catastrophic events, and then it's like things get very disorganized. That was my experience for sure.
Yeah.
Complex PTSD.
Absolutely. So developmental trauma, pre-conscious or pre-cognitive trauma. So this is trauma that happens before the age of around 18 months to 2 years of age. It's around that time, 18 months to 2 years, where the part of our brain comes online that can actually store memory. So it can store visual representations, auditory representations, even smells. Before that, we haven't got the ability to store memories, but we can still accumulate trauma. As Matt said right near the start, trauma is stored within the body, within the soma, and experiences that happen from when we are born or during the time that we are born or in the womb up until those first 18 months to 2 years of life can get stored in the body. And once again, when we get into the body and start to work, we can start to unwind these processes in the body. So really important. human beings, it wasn't until the 80s that the West acknowledged that children under the age of 2 years could feel pain, let alone store traumatic imprints. It makes my skin crawl when I think about, if you had to perform a medical procedure on a child that was that young, they wouldn't give them any pain relief. They'd give them a paralytic drug, which would paralyze them, but they would feel everything for an operation or surgery, which is the definition of torture at the end of the day. Once again, because they didn't believe, they won't remember, they don't feel pain, all of that kind of stuff. Seems crazy to us now to think that, but it wasn't that long ago that we thought that as a society.
What comes up for me when hearing that is like the level of disconnection and misattunement they must have from themselves in order to do that to an infant and not realize that it's feeling pain.
Yeah.
It's like the level of trauma within the individual that would be able to do that would be a high level of trauma.
Absolutely. Then we have intergenerational or genealogical trauma. So these are traumas that can get passed down through the generations, traumatic imprints in our DNA. Someone just commented, generational trauma is so very present in our culture. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so many different traumas can get passed down through our genealogical lines. The beauty of that is, when we start to own that within ourselves and start to work on this stuff, then we get to break those patterns, which is amazing, because who knows how many generations this has gone back, but more importantly, who knows how many generations it would have gone forward unless we had the courage and the guts to tackle this stuff and break that. There was a meme that was circulating maybe a couple of weeks ago, and it was a great visual representation of I think it was a woman, a mother, and there was many generations behind her all kind of screaming hate, I think, at her, and she was like shielding her child from that and sending that child love. And it was a great representation of what the power of changing a lot of those genealogical issues. Because what we want to resolve that, so not so our kids won't go through issues, but so they'll have different ones to deal with, not the same ones that keep going down through the generations and the generations. Collective trauma is the next one. So these are these cultural or collective narratives that we have. One of them that was put in the comments was, men not crying. I had that one. I had boys don't cry. I heard that at an early age somewhere. I also got told I was a sook whenever I started to cry. So that meant that I didn't cry for about 15 years. That was extremely unhealthy. Led to massive amounts of depression, anxiety, and drug addiction. So these are some of these narratives that we do need to break. And once again, they're not right or wrong, good or bad. We're born into, I think Matt's term is, we're born into like a cultural soup. And as we're born into that soup, we pick up on these cultural beliefs. And we have to work out, hey, what are these cultural beliefs that are actually serving me, and what are the ones that are greatly diminishing my true expression as a human being?
Are they true? And no, like we made them up. So many things I got told as a kid. It's like when I look back, it's, by my school, by this, it's like who made that up? Who came up with that? It's like someone just made it up, and then it eventually became a collective belief system. It's like a damaging belief as well. It's like someone just decided that this is the way it is, boys don't cry, one day. Like, how did that come about? It's really odd.
It got legs, didn't it? Like it got legs.
Yeah, it did, yeah. Got some mileage on it.
It's led to a generation of men with massive amounts of suppressed energy in their system that tends to come out in not so compassionate ways.
Yeah.
All right, so that's the types of trauma. We talk about the importance of safety in that. Safety is such an important word when it comes to trauma. I think, is it Levine who says safety is healing, or is it Porges?
Stephen Porges.
Stephen Porges, creator of polyvagal theory. Safety is healing. When our system feels safe enough, then we'll be able to welcome in these traumatic imprints, and they can start to dissolve and process in that safety. Because you got to think, a traumatic imprint, which we've covered already, it's the opposite of safety. It is threat. Okay, enough of those imprints. No wonder we lose our sense of safety. And so many clients that Matt and I have worked with have just lost any sense of safety. I know I hadn't felt safe in my body for decades. It's like, no wonder somebody reaches for alcohol or drugs or gambling or a relationship or sex or food, whatever it is, because, if we don't feel safe in our body, then life, it ain't much fun, unfortunately.
And safety is a felt sense. It doesn't necessarily have to even be the absence of threat. You know, it's just a felt sense of almost being at home within yourself.
Well, that's what we talk, like home.
That's how I experience it.
Yeah, it's like if we jump over here, just the effects of trauma, and we talk about the neuroscience of trauma, and that's one thing when it comes to the nervous system. It's like home or homeostasis. You know, if we think about all addictions and all of these behaviors, these compulsive behaviors, are an attempt for a human being to try and regulate a dysregulated nervous system. We're trying to come back into homeostasis. We're trying to feel some sense of connection or safety because we've lost the ability to do that naturally based on what we've been through. And so we don't know how to do that. It seems impossible. So all of a sudden a substance or something external to us becomes very attractive because it mightn't give us that full sense of safety, but it might just give us a taste, and a taste is better than nothing at all. And that's why people will, people don't understand addiction. When you have a trauma-informed lens, then all of a sudden you can have extreme compassion for anybody going through addiction and not go, how can they make these stupid choices? Don't they realize they're ruining their life and they're disappointing all of us and they're making the family look bad? Yeah, they do know that, but they can't stop because Keith Richards said it best, the contortions that we will go to just not to be ourselves for a few hours. Yeah, and we'll go through all of the contortions, trying to score drugs or whatever it is, all of the repercussions of withdrawal and detox and all that, just to not feel like ourselves for a time because ourselves is too traumatized and doesn't feel safe.
Obliterate, that was my goal. Obliterate my sense of self, until I'm not even there anymore, be as close to unconscious as possible.
Yeah, because it's like, if we talk about, that core belief, there's something wrong with me, and it's like, we don't want to be around someone who we feel is inherently fucked up. And so it's like if I had a friend who I didn't want to be around, then I can leave. I can tell them to go home or I can go home. When we hate ourselves, there's nowhere to go. We're there. That's why we try and alter our consciousness, because that's the only way we can get some sort of reprieve from ourselves. And yeah, me and Matt spent many years in active addiction doing that, just trying to escape that current level of consciousness and not be present for our experience. So we'll just quickly touch on the rest here because we're really waffling on today. It's good. So the effects of trauma. Yeah, I know. So we'll go for a little bit longer. We'll just touch on some other key points. I hope you're all enjoying it if you're tuning in. So the neuroscience of trauma, we talk about trauma and memory, how trauma can really affect memory. At the end of the day, all memory is subjective. None of us see an objective truth, but our subjective memory is very real for us and it should be treated as such. But when we go through traumatic experiences, the priorities of our brain start to change. Our brain is always trying to look for energy efficiency. And so oftentimes our hippocampus will value or prioritize pumping cortisol over correctly storing a memory, so we can start to store memories quite differently. We talk about identity and trauma. Matt spoke about personality early on. We like to go online and do personality tests so I can try and work out who I am, when who I am is generally made up of a bunch of traumatic imprints. So it's not really who we are, it's a lot of these contortions. So our identity can be massively shaped by traumatic imprints.
It's false personality traits.
Yeah,
that's what an adaptation is. When it comes to this, it's like false personality traits.
Yeah, absolutely. And trauma and relationships. You want to find out where you're triggered and where you've got traumatic imprints. Relationship is the best place to do that. Like Matt said, it's a lot of these traumas were made relationally and they show up in relationships later in life. The beauty is if you're committed and also if your partner is committed and understand, if you both have a trauma-informed lens in relationship, then you can cut through so much of the bullshit and actually get to the core of what's going on so much faster, as opposed to having these surface level, arguments around, taking the bin out or, that kind of thing. So relationships are a great one, and trauma in our worldview, just like our identity, traumatic imprints do really shape our worldview. The ideas that the world is an inherently unsafe place, that there's threat, that life is hard, all of these kind of things come up. So I'll just bring up, we also talk about in the course, recognizing trauma. So talking about the bottom up approach and the top down approach. Matt and I, what we teach is really working from the bottom up, which just means we're really working in the body. Okay, we're really unpacking these orphan parts and these imprints, and then we're kind of working from the top. And after we've moved through a lot of the contortions, the sensations, the emotions, then we can start to get some conscious awareness and some conscious learnings and some wisdom around these events. The felt sense, similar thing, the felt sense of who we are in the body, not just our cognitive interpretation of who we are. You know, we talk about somatic identity a lot, and it's like, it's different, like, you know, if you meet someone and have to describe yourself and like, well, I'm Ryan and I run this business and I'm a father and, you know, I like sport, and these are just mental constructs. But the felt sense is
the things you do.
The things you do. Yeah. The person I like to present to the world. The felt sense, the somatic identity is, what does it feel like to be Ryan in this body in this moment? And the reason why we don't like to look there is because that could be shame, could be guilt, there could be a lot of anger, could be all sorts of stuff. But until we start to look at that, it's very hard to start to unwind what's happening in the body. Disembodiment versus embodiment, we talk about that. The importance of nervous system regulation, we've talked about the nervous system a bit already. We talk about foundations as a trauma-informed coach, so holding space, attunement, traps coaches can fall into, which is those one of those traps is that fixing mentality, that there's something inherently wrong with a client. Emotions, not too much we need to cover there, I don't think. And the last one is trauma in the subconscious. So a lot of these traumatic imprints are stored within the subconscious, which is that deeper part of the brain, which we'll revert back to under times of stress. Self-sabotage, just one of the great, the biggest outcomes of a lot of traumatic imprints is self-sabotage. So many clients that I've worked with over the years have a belief that they don't deserve to be happy. Once again, because they feel like there's something wrong with them. If I have a belief that I don't deserve to be happy, every time that I start to become what I deem to be happy, I'll sabotage myself. I'll fuck it up in some way. I will, go and gamble all the money I've saved. I'll have an affair and cheat on the person I'm in a relationship with. I'll go and have a bender for 4 days. It's all this self-sabotaging behavior, which comes from these deep imprints that say, hey, you don't deserve this because, everyone else is okay. They deserve it, but not you when you look in the mirror. This self-hatred. And then we touch on trauma and spirituality at the end, which really, Matt and I aren't tied to any particular dogma or ideology, but when we start to ask those deeper questions, if I'm not what's happened to me, then what am I? That kind of opens up a much deeper question around what spirituality might mean for an individual, and that path is very, very unique. Did you have anything to add to that one, Matt?
No, I think, personally they're inseparable. Working with all these parts brings us to a deeper sense of, I look at the word spirituality, spirit as what we actually are underneath all these layers. And I think it's like the journey of healing trauma and the spiritual journey are inseparable. And like a really grounded spirituality, not trying to get to some astral transcendence plane or evolve into the fifth dimension and all that sort of stuff. All that sort of stuff's cool, but it's like if we haven't grounded and landed in ourselves first, then what is it that moves to another dimension, really? But like I see them as inseparable. I see trauma work as a spiritual practice.
Yeah. So true. And so that is, I think we'll wrap it up there. The reason why, like I said, we're so passionate about creating a trauma-informed lens is, and it's not just for coaches and therapists. Like we would love, our idea is to start bringing some of these learnings like into rehabs and their staff, or mental health clinics and the staff, and even healthcare in general. There's so much data out there now showing that these traumatic imprints can show up with our physical health as well. And, I've never, when I've gone to a doctor with different physical issues, they've never asked me about the deep emotional roots of it. It's more like, emotional roots, take this medication instead. Not that there's a place for medication, but it's good to look at the whole human being, the whole system, and not just one aspect. And so we're very, very passionate about teaching this. We thank you so much to everyone that has joined us live today. If you have any questions, hit us up. You can send me a private message if you have a private question. I've just put the link to the course in the comments. If you're watching the replay, thanks for watching to the end. Just put #replay. Any questions that you have, put them in the comments, and we're happy to jump on and answer them. So thank you so much for joining us today. Matt, pleasure as always, my friend.
Thanks, Ryan.
All right, see you later, everyone.